way of thinking about educational learning. You can use games for any kind of learning philosophy you have. But if you look at how commercial games are successful, then they actually have a lot of the learning principles that this federation calls for, you can say, and that we find very rarely in edutainment titles. Just to kind of, before digging into then what can be done differently and what is it that I suggest that we do differently to make better games, then it's important to remember that this is not a new problem. We've been doing educational games at least since the 60s. The Prussian army used it in the 1870s for military training, and since the 60s, there's actually been a pretty formal research into board games, role-playing games, using games for educational purposes. And back then, they were convinced that this would be an ingrained and integrated part of the educational system within years. It hasn't yet. In the 70s, you began with the early experiment of digital educational games that were also extremely promising. Some of the games that are actually selling best still in the US are from the 70s with updated graphics, but nevertheless. And in the 80s, you really saw almost a dot-com bubble of edutainment industry in the US. You had I think 3,000 edutainment titles a year in the US, and you had a lot of mergers and buyouts and all these fancy words. And then things kind of came to a standstill. It seemed like people realized that edutainment games wasn't really delivering what they were expecting. They weren't really being that integrated in schools, and things kind of died out a bit in the mid-80s. And then things kind of picked up again a bit in the 90s and kind of died out a bit in the mid-90s again. And then in 2002, 2003, the serious games movement started, which kind of said, okay, we can do better than this, but we need to get closer to what games are instead of being too blindsided, but by the educational constraints and requirement from curriculum and teachers and publishers, educational publishers. And what actually, when I kind of look back over the history and kind of read what went wrong, then it's very much about forgetting the game in the process. So when we think about educational games, we have to remember that kind of the starting point was that we wanted to use games that was motivating, engaging, challenging to actually create a different educational experiences. And along the way, in these hypes, this tend to be forgotten. So with this this turned around paper, scissors, and rock annotation, it's quite important to remember that what we are doing is games, and that's the medium that we're trying to create different kind of educational experience. And with that, I'm gonna try to look at then. So how can we develop more meaningful and better learning games? And this kind of takes a detour because, as I said, it's important to remember what's kind of on the commercial scene. And I think it's very important to recognize that games, as a very fundamental structure, is learning machines. They're built in a way that you're actually learning while playing. And to succeed in a game, you have to learn and master certain skills to progress. If you look at some of these examples, how many of you know at least one of these games? Great. How many of you have played all of the games? So there's research ahead. Just to go very quickly through all of these, I mean, in my view, all of these have educational potentials. They're not designed specifically for education. I doubt they have even been thinking about learning while they develop the games. But they have, almost all of them, except maybe Bully, has been used in formal educational settings, both in the UK, the US, and other countries. And they have been tested, researched quite thoroughly. The first one is SimCity, which is basically your urban planning game where you have to act within the problem space of a city, and you have to solve different problems and prioritize your resources to create a thriving city. And in the process, you have to understand how a city is built up, what role does crime, pollution, employment, etc. play in that kind of environment. The second one is Civilization, which is basically, playing a civilization. How do you put a city in the right geographical spot? What advances do you have to do technically to kind of get the upper hand? What trade routes do you need to establish? And in the process, learning a bit about, well, basically about geography. Why does a civilization thrive? Why do they die out? What different strategies can they have for living in world history, succeeding in world history? The third one is a pretty recent one, the Spore game, which I think probably most of you have heard about. It's basically about evolution, you can say, and tries to use evolution as a game mechanic and allow the player to kind of evolve through mankind all the way from single cells to space. And the last one is Bully, which is probably the least obvious example, but it's basically about arriving at a boarding school and seeing what it means to be at a boarding school and the choices and problems you faces and being at a boarding school. This would probably be quite educational in therapy of some boarding students like 40 years ago. So in all of these games you have a virtual universe, you have a problem space that you act within to solve different challenges, and to solve those challenges you have to recognize how the system works, you have to master this system, and as you do that you will progress and get a better score and progress. If we kind of look at what then kind of makes a good game, and a guy called Ralph Costa has looked at this, and this is some of his stuff I've expanded on. The first thing that I think is important is that any good learning game also have to be a good game, and developing good games are actually extremely difficult. There's developed thousands and thousands of games each year, and only a fraction of these become a success. If you look at what a game is kind of made up of, you can say that there are what you can call substantives, and there are verbs. So substantives is basically, describing the scenery and the story. So if we made a game about this conference room, there would be, substantives. There would be chairs, there would be tables, there would be people, there would be a microphone, there would be all different kinds of things that made this setting. There might even be a background story that, this is an interesting conference and the mad professor is going to kill us all if we don't do well within the next couple of hours. So you kind of have this background that should be to some extent interesting. And then you have what actually sets games aside, which are the verbs. Any television, radio, book can actually set up a nice scenery, a background story. And to some extent they actually do it better than games in some of the areas. But what sets games aside is that you have the verbs and that you can actually do something within this environment. And the verbs consist of that you basically have this virtual world that's a problem space. You make choices and decisions in this space. There are consequences from these choices. You get feedback on your choices. And these choices and decisions have to have some kind of balance. If it's too easy, it's boring. If it's too hard, it's also not very interesting. And there has to be some kind of reward structure. If you get these things right, you have an engaging, challenging game. And this is kind of what sets games aside. If you look at learning games, then they have to have this basic substantives and verbs. They have to be very conscious about how this works. But they also have other challenges, because basically when you look at substantives and verbs, you can say that the substantives are about is this a relevant setting for learning. So for example, I have a few examples up here. The first one is a very simple Danish game about the British invasion of Copenhagen in 1800. And I've tried to look at three different factors that is quite crucial to make sure that you have a strong learning game. The first one is obviously motivation, which is kind of the total sum of the verbs and substantives of the is it engaging, challenging, and interesting.